Hello, and welcome to the Science for a Conscious World podcast. My name is Olga Ferreras, and today I'm talking with Terence Sexton about his research into how leaders can develop their consciousness so they gain greater capability to tackle the complex problems society is facing today. Terry, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about your study.
Thank you, Olga. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Terry, you are a business psychologist and an executive coach. You have been working on executive profiling processes and leadership development. And now you sorry. And now you're conducting research at a PhD level in order to answer the question. Okay, it's a big question, so bear with me, everybody. How can change makers develop their consciousness to the post-conventional stages within a post-material worldview in ways they and others believe can enhance their ability to make a positive difference in the world? To better understand the potential impact of your story, Terry, I think there are a few concepts that would be valuable if you can help us understand. So perhaps my first question is, what is leadership performance for change makers?
Yeah, thank you, Olga. Yeah, and I recognise that question, the very academic question, full of lots of jargon. It certainly needs unpacking. And what is leadership performance? That's a really interesting question, because when I've been doing this work, developing people's leadership, many people don't like to be called a leader, because they associate being a leader with people who have created a lot of the problems we face in society. They blame leaders for the problems we're facing. But even though they are using their leadership to try and solve these problems, they don't want to be don't want to be called a leader as such. So that's why we've used the phrase change maker. But then again, which came out in the research, people are uncomfortable with that term, change maker, because they say, what right have I got to create change? So we struggle with this language around leadership and change makers. But in terms of leadership performance, I believe all of us are leaders. We all lead in different ways. So leadership is something we do. It's not necessarily a role or who we are. It's something we all do. So then what is leadership performance? Well, before I started doing the research, I thought leadership was all about change, creating change. If you create change, then you're a leader. If you maintain stability, you're a manager, is the way I looked at it. But what's come out from the research is that there's a range of leadership interventions that change makers use, from the really tangible actions that people can see, right the way through to very subtle, intangible actions that they take. So little conversations here and there, changing the culture or the mood or the atmosphere, really subtle, really small. But what they said to me is, whilst they get reviewed and perhaps get rewarded and get funding for the big tangible leadership actions they take, they recognise that the biggest difference they make in society is at the subtle end. These really intangible, small changes that they use, where they sense into what's happening and then make subtle adjustments to change things, to change the dynamics, to change the culture. That's where they believe they make the biggest difference. So what is leadership performance? Well, the researchers said it's from a range from the real tangible actions right through to the very subtle ones.
I see. Well, it's such an interesting perspective. I never stopped to think about it and to think about leaders. I think I had that conventional view, like your participants, thinking that the leaders are just the ones that we hate because they brought us to where we are. And I think it's fascinating that you know what you said about modesty. It's like people we want leaders to that can recognize the limitations and can be modest. And at the same time, we shy, people who have those qualities shy away from leadership positions, right? Because or from being recognized or identified as a leader, supported as leaders, because everything that is connected to the world leader and
Well,
if
that's
I
right.
got that, yeah.
Yeah, and I think modesty or humility is an important part of leadership, because what came out from the research as well is that to demonstrate the tangible leadership actions where you can really make a difference that can be seen, and you have to intervene to create that change and perhaps lead from the front, you need a very confident ego. And when I say ego, what we're talking about here is your self-identity, your sense of self and who you are. So you need to be very confident. But it was recognized that if that confidence, having a confident ego, develops into having a big ego where you're leading to serve yourself rather than leading to serve others, then that's a problem. But then on the other end, the subtle leadership, the intangible leadership, they talked about it's good to have a quiet ego because you're making a difference, you're making changes, but nobody sees them. Nobody recognizes you for the work you're doing. So therefore, if you've got an ego that needs to be recognized, you're not going to do very well in the subtle leadership. So the subtle leadership, you need a quiet ego. So it's not about you. But what that enables you is you quieten down the ego, then you're able to tune into the relational field. You can tune into the dynamics. You can tune into other people. And therefore, you can understand what's going on and where you need to intervene to make these subtle changes. So it requires a quiet ego. So you could say the subtle leadership is more modest, more humble. Perhaps it is, yes.
Oh, that's lovely. And Terry, something else that I think needs explaining more is what is consciousness? What is, certain conception of consciousness important in order to like connect the dots in your story? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. Because I've talked about helping leaders to develop their consciousness so they can gain a greater capability to engage with and hopefully solve the complex problems we're facing. So then that is the question, well, what is consciousness? And it's a big unanswered question in our society. Nobody knows what it is for sure, and nobody knows what creates it. It's the big unanswered question in science. They call it the hard problem. And I looked at one study where a person identified 40 different definitions of consciousness in the research literature. You know, so
Yeah.
it is difficult, yeah. But what came out from the research with the participants, the change makers, is they defined consciousness as our ability to be aware and to respond. So our ability to be aware of the problems that society is facing and the complexity of it, and then the ability to be able to respond to those problems. So consciousness is really about raising conscious awareness, raising our awareness to be aware of what's going on. But then our ability to respond is really developing our psychological functions, how we think, how we feel, how we behave. And that enables us to respond. So there's two sides of it. But on what I recognize in that definition, that's more about what consciousness does rather than what consciousness is.
Mhm.
Yeah. So it is about being aware and being able to respond. So what consciousness does. And most of the definitions in society or in science are
Yeah.
about what consciousness does. They don't say what it is. But my research is based in a post-materialist worldview. So first of all, materialism says that it's the neurons in our brain, the matter in our brain that
Yeah.
produces consciousness. Yeah, so matter is primary. Matter produces consciousness. That's materialism. But that's only been around 100, 200 years at most. Prior to that, there was a view that consciousness was a universal force which was out there, and
Yeah.
our brains filtered consciousness in. So consciousness is universal, it's primary, nothing produces it, it's primary, and therefore consciousness produces matter, many people argue. And that's come through in quantum physics as well. There's a lot of talk in quantum physics and a lot of research that suggests that consciousness is primary, it produces matter. So for me, I like to view consciousness as being a psychological energy that is universal, that we filter in, that our brains filter in and make it individual. So that means we're all connected. We're all connected to this universal consciousness, but we make it as an individual. And the philosopher Bernardo Kastrup, he said, what we recognize is that individual consciousness is really universal. It's just we become dissociated from it. So we no longer recognize we're part of the universal consciousness. We think it's just within us, but in reality, it is everywhere, and we're just filtering it in, so we're all connected.
So would there be then, Terry, oh, well, I think probably I shouldn't even go here because this is not something that we can resolve in a conversation. But you know how Jung talked about an unconscious that was collective and an unconscious that was personal. Like consciousness would be equal to that collective unconscious. It would. This is what. Okay. So,
Yeah, I think so. I think so. And he collaborated with a physicist, I think Wolfgang Pauli, I think, to create that idea of
Oh,
collective consciousness.
right.
But
The
what they're
physicist.
really talking about is universal consciousness. But yeah, everything then, if you like, the collective consciousness is that our experiences, whilst we do perhaps filter consciousness into us, all our experiences go back into the collective again. And that's what Jung would talked about. So yeah, all of human and animal perhaps experiences are in that collective consciousness. But you know, it goes right back to the Greek. Plotinus, I think, he talks about it as well as a collective consciousness. Henry Bergson, another philosopher, he talks about it, and it came through with the early pioneers of psychology. William James, he talks about collective consciousness or universal consciousness. Yeah, and right through to Aldous Huxley in The Doors of Perception. And he said the brain is like a reducing valve, only lets a measly trickle of consciousness flow through, just enough to keep us alive on this particular planet. Well, I think we're not really keeping ourselves alive on this particular planet anymore. So it's time to open that reducing valve, give it a quarter turn, let more consciousness flow through. So certainly Aldous Huxley thought that consciousness was universal and we filter it or flow it through ourselves.
I love that, Terry. I love that, get the volume up or, the, yes, and let more flow in. That sounds
Well, that's
amazing.
right. And it's interesting because I can talk about what the literature was saying in this area and then talk
Mm,
about what came out from the research as well. So with the literature that addresses universal consciousness,
yeah,
it was generally viewed that as it flows into us, it gets filtered or used up by other psychological entities within us. And one of them being our ego that I mentioned earlier. So the ego, our sense of self, our sense of identity, takes up a lot of consciousness in the form of energy. It takes up that conscious energy, yeah, to maintain the ego. And then, of course, as well, as we go through life, we pick up psychological scars or, if you like, psychological detritus and rubbish. And perhaps that blocks the filter, so that reduces the flow of consciousness even more. So when it comes to that energy of consciousness flowing through to our psychological functions, how we think, feel and behave, there's only a measly trickle left. So consciousness development is really about quietening down the ego, clearing out all that detritus, clearing the filters to allow more conscious energy to flow through to how we think, feel and behave. And therefore, we have more psychological capacity in those functions. We can think in a more complex way. We can behave with more agility. We can be more emotionally intelligent. So that's what the literature says, is basically if we learn to quieten down our ego, then we can have more ability to work with complexity. We can work at a higher level of consciousness. So that's what consciousness development is about. And that's what I took into the research from the literature. And then what came out from the research was, as you remember, we talked about that the changemakers found that they are more successful in their leadership if they engage with subtle leadership.
yeah.
And the subtle leadership requires a quieter ego, as we talked about. But also what that allows them to do is to tune into that relational field. So it's not so much about them, it's being very aware of what's going on around them, tuning in. And they said they do that most effectively when they enter into what's called a flow state of consciousness. So this is where the ego really quietens down and they're just there in flow. And they say they always know when they've been in flow because they can't remember what they said. because it's not about them. There's tuned so much into other people. But other people come to them
Wow.
and say, well, it's really good you said that. That really helped. So they get a lot of positive feedback, but they can't remember saying it because they're
Yeah,
in flow. So again,
that's
it's the same
beautiful.
result. It's
Yeah.
quietening down the ego, tuning into others
Mm.
and being in flow and using your leadership to serve others. So the literature review and the research results came
Yeah.
together at that point.
How do you see you applying what you learned from this research in order to help us with just this vacuum of leadership that we have in the world right now? What is the aim of your research? How do you bring this in a to a practical territory?
Well, it's a really good question. And one of the reasons why I was attracted to the Alef Trust and Liverpool John Moores University is because the PhD I'm studying for is in applied transpersonal psychology. So how do we apply it? That's right. And I've just completed the first study, which has identified that the subtle leadership is most effective, and what enables people to engage in subtle leadership is quieting down the ego. And that's most effective when leaders enter into a state of flow consciousness. And now, since I've gone back to the literature to understand it a little bit more, what I found is that what is conducive to entering into flow state of consciousness is when you practice altered states of consciousness, practice peak experiences, and that then sort of develops your consciousness. It quiets down the ego, lets more consciousness flow through. So my second study now is, well, how can we help leaders to develop their consciousness so they have greater capability? So what all of this is pointing to is, how can we help leaders experience and practice with altered states of consciousness? And the altered states we're talking about are peak experiences that we all have, actually consciously practicing those to try and make them happen. And that's what the research, both what I've conducted and what the literature is saying, is a way to develop the consciousness of leaders so they have more capability to engage with the complex problems that we're facing. But that's my second study now, and that is the how we do
Your
it.
purpose to help develop leaders in every sector of society and building methods that would be accessible to all is such a wonderful purpose. I wish you the best. And time runs fast. It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thank you, Olga. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. I've very much enjoyed it. Thank you.